Hello, Holy Trinity small groups. It is great to be with you today. I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Jane.
And today we're delighted to be pressing into our 6th video on the subject of Nehemiah, our series for small groups. And last week we took a departure from our usual church content to look at a video by Pete Winter, who talked about stepping into the ring, what those first steps of beginning to partner with God to build the kingdom with him might look like. And one area that he touched on was the subject of opposition, what to do when, as the people of God, we face opposition for obeying the Lord. And that's the subject that we're actually going to push into deeper today. We're going to look at how we should expect to face spiritual opposition when we're working with God and for God. And also we're going to talk a little bit about how we might handle it. But with that in mind, Jane, perhaps you could fill us in on where we are with Nehemiah and what he's up to.
Of course. This week we're in chapter 6 with Nehemiah and the people of God right in the thick of the rebuilding work. They've been working in unity, each with their own area of assignment, but each therefore contributing to the overall work of the community. As they've done this, they've encountered some opposition. Nevertheless, Nehemiah has managed to stay attentive to the work at hand. It's only now that they're well underway, though, that he faces really tough opposition. Here in chapter 6, he receives a series of messages from leaders of nearby nations who would dearly love to disrupt the work. We hear the names of Sanballat, Tobiah and Geshem, who are the leaders of some of these peoples: Edom, Moab, Ammon and Samaria, all historic enemies of Israel, and yet all now under the power of the Persian Empire, just the same as Israel.
That's right, and they try all sorts of tactics to disrupt the rebuilding, don't they?
Yes, lots. Mostly they send messages, but all different sorts. At first they try to lure Nehemiah away from his work by asking him to meet them. And who knows what sorts of harm they intended. When Nehemiah refuses, they turn to intimidation, initially threatening to tell the Persian overlords that Israel is up to no good, and then making threats on Nehemiah's life to try and scare him into abandoning the work. Through it all, Nehemiah is steadfastly devoted to the work he knows God has called him to do. It's not that the threats and trickery make no impact upon him, but his faith and obedience outweigh the temptation to give in to fear or deceit.
So Nehemiah is a pretty good role model then, someone that we can learn a lot from. But I think also we can learn a lot just from his situation, the situation that he finds himself in, because he's someone who stays devoted to the Lord, but also someone who stays devoted to the Lord even in the midst of really difficult situations. And if we take the Bible as a whole, it should come as no surprise to us that Nehemiah actually finds himself facing opposition when he sets out to obey the Lord. Actually, that's a truth that we find throughout the Bible. And there's a terrific passage in Ephesians 6 where Paul talks about this as a reality for the people of God in this age. Paul says, "Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his power. Put on the whole armour of God so that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For our struggle is not against enemies of blood and flesh, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers of this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." And I think this passage is a really helpful summary of something that we see throughout Scripture, actually. If we cast our mind back to Genesis, we see the beginning of a spiritual battle which has been raging since the time of creation. In Genesis, we read about the existence of Satan, a being who is created, but who throughout the Bible opposes God's will, and especially the people of God as they seek to do God's will. And then this carries throughout the Old Testament. We see him popping up in places like Job and behind the scenes, but it also comes into the Gospel, where we find Jesus opposing Satan, most notably, obviously, in the desert with the temptations, but also as Jesus casts out demons, he's opposing the kingdom of Satan, the kingdom of darkness. And John's Gospel actually frames this as a contest between light on one hand and darkness on the other. But in Matthew, Mark and Luke, we also see the opposition between the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of this world, or the kingdom of evil. And then Paul picks up this theme here in Ephesians, where he reminds us that in working for God, we are also working against an enemy, and that enemy would love to derail God's plan and the work of God's people. The Bible's absolutely clear that Satan has no power against us when we stay obedient to the Lord. When we stay with our eyes fixed on God, there is nothing that Satan can achieve. But it's helpful to remember, I think, that as we set out to obey God and to do his work, we are living in a deeper spiritual existence, a deeper spiritual reality, which affects what we see here in the physical. It's ongoing in the background. We have to remember that, as Paul says, our struggle is against cosmic powers of this present darkness, spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places.
So, if we look at the book of Nehemiah with this in mind, we can probably learn quite a lot from Nehemiah's own experience of opposition to the work of God, as well as from the ways in which he handled it. We've mentioned already, for example, that the opposition didn't happen just as a one-off. In chapter 6, it's a continual feature. Whatever Nehemiah and his people set themselves to do, it's as if their enemies always have a response to try and shut them down. When the war was completed and the Israelites were about to start on the gate, Sanballat and Geshem tried to distract Nehemiah by asking him to interrupt the work to come and meet with them. It seems like a pretty reasonable and polite request, but it masks their desire to bring a halt to the work for a while. Not only that, but they repeat the request 4 times. On the 5th attempt, they change tactic. They send an open letter in which it is written, "It is reported among the nations," and Geshem also says it, "that you and the Jews intend to rebel. That is why you are building the wall, and that according to this report you wish to become their king. You have also set up prophets to proclaim in Jerusalem concerning you. There is a king in Judah, and now it will be reported to the king according to these words. So come therefore and let us confer together." Can you see how Nehemiah's enemies have switched tactics, turning from distraction to intimidation? We have to remember the context. These enemies represent historic enemies of Israel, who are nevertheless in a very similar situation to them. They are under the authority of the Persian Empire.
So what this represents then as an intimidation tactic is a little bit school playground-esque, isn't it? It's I'm going to go and tell on you to the big boss. I'm going to make up lies about you. And they want to tell to a higher authority, but what they forget is that Nehemiah serves a higher authority even than Persia. He serves the sovereign God himself.
Yes, and when this doesn't work either, they resort to trickery. They hire people to tell Nehemiah, falsely, that his life is in danger, and try to convince him to stop his work and hide away in the temple. Keeping in mind Satan's continual practice throughout history of trying to tempt people to sin against God, it's interesting to reflect that in this way, Nehemiah's enemies were also attempting to get him to sin. Nobody except the high priest was allowed inside the inner sanctuary of the temple, not even Nehemiah. To sum this all up, Nehemiah experienced multiple and repeated attempts to derail his work, demonstrating a real variety of tactics. He had to stay on his toes.
Definitely. A lot of conclusions there for us to draw, I think. And number one, it's important that we take this reality of spiritual opposition seriously when we're setting out to do God's work. Forearmed is forewarned, as they say, and Paul tells us we have to be aware that we are living in a spiritual struggle, and God's work won't be unopposed. We will have to acknowledge the spiritual reality that we live in. And I'm really struck in this regard by a couple of words that come through in this passage, and in different translations of the Bible it's put differently. So in verse 12 of this passage, it says that Nehemiah realised that these opposition tactics were not of God, but were attempts to disrupt God's work. But I like the NRSV even more. It says that Nehemiah perceived and saw what was going on. And that's a really visual imagery that's used. And I think that's an important one for us to bear in mind, that we have to perceive and see the reality of what's going on around us to see what is of God and what is not of God.
So, in that case, we'll need to be aware of what opposition might look like, won't we? We've already talked about the different tactics: distraction, intimidation, trickery. What they all seem to have in common, actually, is a convincing layer of deceit. For example, the distracting invitation to attend a meeting masked an attempt to harm Nehemiah. And then the open letter sent by Sanballat is full of accusation and hearsay. It is reported among the nations, and Geshem also says it, that you and the Jews intend to rebel. That is why you are building the wall, and according to this report you wish to become their king. It's all hearsay and speculation. Even though it sounds plausible, There was no truth in it. It's all accusation, as if Nehemiah's enemies are hoping that if they throw enough mud at the wall, some of it will stick.
I think that's a really good point, Jane, because actually this makes the whole idea of spiritual opposition quite relatable. When you talk to people about spiritual opposition, some people might think that sounds a bit kooky, but here we're talking about voices that we hear that are actually trying to disrupt what we're doing. And I wonder, how often do we hear those own voices in our own heads, especially when we're setting out to follow Jesus in something? You know, that's something that I experience regularly, especially when I'm preparing preaching or even for this video. I wonder, how often do we listen to these voices because they're so convincing? Very often they sound so clever and compelling. They play on doubts and our fears, when actually we just need to be pressing on. They have a grain of truth in them, but they distort the truth. Because, you know, here, Nehemiah, he wasn't setting himself up to be the king. He wasn't saying that he was going to be the king in Judah, but like a lot of Jews at the time, he would have hoped for a king in Judah. He wanted Judah to be its own sovereign nation, a nation under God. It just was that he wasn't setting himself up against the Persians. But there is a grain of truth, but you see how it's distorted. And that's a tactic that we might find quite often in our lives as we set out to obey God. You know, there's a similar tactic that I face when I talk about preaching and preparing video content even. You know, I get that sense of God's word is so big, it's so enormous and so powerful. And there are so many that are cleverer and better than you. How can you possibly pull anything out of this that's going to be of any use to the church and build it up? The problem is, if I listen to these voices, the temptation is to give in and not do the work at all. But that actually wouldn't be godly, because I know that God has called me to this work. And I think it's hard as well when these voices aren't just coming from our own heads or within us, but they come from other people, some that may even be friends, even social media, actually.
Yes, and I've got an example of that as well. When I was a newly qualified therapist, my first independent foray into the clinical world, and had a caseload all by myself of mental health conditions. And I had to go out there by myself, and those voices started, "You're not good enough, you're not going to do it, you really are stupid, you can't do it." And it compound that with the fact that the work was really difficult and very challenging. It was a difficult time, but I learned techniques and strategies to dampen down those voices and achieve what I am today, which is quite an experienced therapist, and that I can do it and have that self-belief.
That's a really good example, actually. So, Jane, with that in mind, with those examples, what do you think that we can learn from this passage about resisting spiritual opposition?
I think we build up techniques and strategies just like Nehemiah did. You can almost visualise his wall that he's built, and that he's put the gate on eventually, and that gate shuts, and those inner voices rebound.
Absolutely. So this wasn't just a reality for Nehemiah, it's a reality for us too. The Bible is clear that Jesus' death on the cross didn't just bring about the forgiveness of our sins, it's also a great victory over Satan and the power of sin and death for all who receive it through faith, because he came to destroy the one who has the power of death, that is the devil, in order to free those who all their lives were held in slavery by the fear of death, as it says in Hebrews 2:14-15. And as it says in 1 Corinthians 15, all God's enemies have been put under his feet.
No matter how confident or persuasive the voices may be which seek to distract, intimidate, or trick us away from completing God's work, we need to remember that victory belongs to the Lord. Satan has no power to oppose us, and he is afraid of our awesome God. So it's important to remember, believe, and to persevere in all we do with this in focus.
That's a really good point, Jane. And I think that this relates to our issue of where our focus is. You know, look how quickly and persistently Nehemiah turned to prayer. It says, doesn't it, "Now, O God, strengthen my hands." God is our strength, whatever fight we find ourselves facing. It also says, "Remember Tobiah and Sanballat, O my God, and the rest of the prophets who wanted to make me afraid." You know, we can name the specific struggles that we face and be confident that God will give us the strength that we need for those fights in particular. I think prayer gives us the confidence to stand firm. And if we disconnect from the voice that's telling us to do the work, actually we're open and vulnerable to lies. We're disconnected to the voice, therefore we're open to other voices. But if we stay connected, As it says in John's Gospel, we hear the voice of our shepherd calling us on. So in prayer, we stay connected to our shepherd's voice, and nothing counterfeit will be able to mislead us.
Yes, prayer is certainly our strength. It's striking how confident Nehemiah can be simply because he's attuned to the one who has called him to do their work. Take Nehemiah's response to Sanballat's letter, for example. No such things as you say have been done. You are inventing them out of your own mind. If it wasn't for the fact that Nehemiah was confident in God rather than his own ability, this would sound almost arrogant. As it happens, the answer simply represents complete confidence, which can only come from complete obedience.
That's right. Our confidence comes from our obedience. Because when we're working for God, we remember that there is no higher authority that has any right to disrupt or oppose us. As Nehemiah said, I am doing a great work and I cannot come down. Why should the work stop while I leave it to come down to you? There's a real humility to this position. Nehemiah is not saying I'm great, he's saying the work that I'm doing is great because the one who sent me to do it is great. And if we humble ourselves like this and stay obedient, we recognise that we come under the highest authority and can be confident because of that.
So there we go, an insight from Nehemiah into what we can expect when we push into our vision as a church and into our own discipleship. Spiritual opposition is a reality of life when we're following Jesus, and we need to be aware of that. But by staying focused on God and what he's called us to do, we can remain confident of our calling, knowing that he who won the greatest victory on the cross has us safely in his hands. Like Nehemiah, let's stand ready to persevere through whatever comes our way, knowing that prayer is our weapon and the source of our confidence.
Thank you, Jane. That's great. And so we're going to hand over now to your group discussions, and our prayer is that you have a really fruitful time. See you soon.